Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about Hume's view regarding personal identity, and we'll touch briefly on his theory of free will. So Hume says, and this is quite explicitly with consideration of arguments like Descartes in mind, where Descartes says, well, I can know that even if, given the sort of fallibility of my senses, what they provide to me is uncertain. I can recognize that if I'm thinking, then I must be existing. And so Descartes takes himself to have found the sort of certain existence of a self. And Hume thinks that Descartes has been a little bit uncareful in his argument. And he says, well, when I think about like what we call the sort of notion of self, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other. So my mind is always occupied by like some particular sort of like experience or some like object of thought or something. Of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. These are things that Hume would classify as impressions, or in some cases, like these could be objects of reason or passions.
They're things you really can feel.
Right. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long as I am insensible of myself, I may be truly said not to exist. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and could I neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate, after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated. Nor do I conceive what is further requisite to make me a perfect non-entity. If anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess that I can reason no longer with him. All that I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may, perhaps, perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself, though I am certain there is no such principle in me.
So I would almost say, does the idea that we're talking about Hume today and that he's existing within this discussion right now within the slideshow, that would that almost make it so that he still does exist, or he's talking about existing
So,
within the actual world, not within the conceptual world?
right. So
Okay.
there's an idea of Hume, and Hume can fully grant that. What he's saying is when we think about like what actually exists, is there like some self? Is that some sort of like object? And recall Descartes thinks, well, it's a kind of thinking thing. It's something completely separable from the material world, from your body. And so Descartes thinks like, I am a mind. I'm a thinking substance. And Hume is saying, well, look, when I introspect and I look for like what I might call myself, I realize that the only means by which I seem to be able to ground any such judgment is by reference to something which connects me to the external world via sense perception. I don't seem to see any kind of, or I can't apprehend myself as some kind of object of pure thinking. He said this sort of claim about being a perfect non-entity. This is a fairly direct shot at Descartes' notion of the self, because Descartes says, look, I'm just a simple thinking thing. I can't be broken down into any further parts. I don't contain beliefs or perceptions or anything of the sort. I somehow interact with physical bodies. I can, in virtue of this, be demonstrated to exist like by physical demonstrable means. But that is not what I am. And Hume is claiming, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. the only way in which I can really sort of like observe anything which I could call a self is by reference to like these aspects of experience. And if you take all of those things away, then it's utterly unclear what is supposed to still be there. And yet, this is exactly what Descartes is committed to. And so, whereas Descartes thinks, look, I have arrived at some claim which I could be perfectly certain about, that I exist. What Hume suggests we ought to sort of take of the matter is, well, look, what we would sort of call a self seems to be the compilation of many sort of disparate dispositions, beliefs, habits, mannerisms, etc. And, well, what of those things must persist through time? And he thinks absolutely nothing. The various sort of beliefs or identities or other aspects which I sort of see myself by, he thinks those are all contingent. And so those can change. And thus there doesn't seem to be any sort of like central core. There's a whole bundle of attributes, and those may change over time. Hume's view is thus that the self is something like a fiction. It's a means by which we can organize things, and it's a means by which we can sort of relate to the world. But it's not something that exists sort of fundamentally in nature. It's projected onto it. It provides a means of organizing it. And so we think similarly, like, look, like tables are a kind of fiction, and selves and tables are both quite useful. But that doesn't mean that they exist sort of fundamentally in their own right, apart from our kind of human activity.
Yeah, and from when you understand that tables are fiction, you can basically understand that the concept of evenness is a fiction, and that where you could almost say that the statement two is even might be false.
Hume thinks that it's like definitionally true. There's other types of naturalists that might go for the view that two is even is false. The motivation for that, and we'll talk a bit more about this like in the rest of the week, is that Hume thinks the claim that two is even is true in a very similar way to the claim that all bachelors are unmarried is true. In other words, he thinks that's true in virtue of meaning. Whereas, say, Platonists and some anti-Platonists think, no, when I'm talking about two, I'm talking about some particular object. And so that thing must exist in the same way that, say, when I say the ink is black, in order for that to be true, the ink must exist. So that's a different sort of view. Hume is going to go for this view that it's true in virtue of like what I mean. And whether that's sort of the best view or the alternative interpretation that says that no, we're talking about an object here. And so like whether it's true depends on whether it exists or not. This is a kind of important interpretive question. Okay. Hume on free will. So Hume says, in sort of thinking about this question of free will, but to proceed in this reconciling project with regard to the question of liberty and necessity, liberty being free will, necessity being what we might call causal determinism, the most contentious question of metaphysics, itself the most contentious science, it will not require many words to prove that all mankind have ever agreed in the doctrine of liberty, as well as in that of necessity, and that the whole dispute in this respect also has been hitherto merely verbal. In other words, it's a matter of confusion about meaning and language. For what is meant by liberty when applied to voluntary actions? We can not surely mean that actions have so little connection with motive, inclination, and circumstance that one does not follow with a certain degree of uniformity from the other. In other words, that say, knowing a particular person, knowing what they intend to do or what their motive is in a particular circumstance, what their like habits and inclinations, what their character is like, and what sort of circumstance they find themselves in. Like, oftentimes you'll be able to make like relatively reliable judgments. Say if you know somebody like quite well, you know like under what conditions they might say like get angry or lose their temper, or if you have to ask them for help, you might know that they're more inclined in like some cases than in others. This again relies on these kind of judgments of causal relations. And Hume thinks, well, look, we perhaps can't provide any sort of like adequate basis that we could have certainty about such relations where they exist in the external world. But we have immediate access to our own sort of like psychological workings. And so we can ascertain from these certain general laws, perhaps, about human inference, about reasoning, etc. And this isn't to say that you can reliably predict human behavior then, but he thinks, look, like we often make judgments and they often can be quite reliable. And of those that we call reasonable, well, they seem to be sort of more constrained and more predictable, whereas those that like we might term madmen, he says, seem to operate with a greater sort of freedom. So he says, we cannot surely mean that actions have so little connection with motives, inclination, and circumstance that one doesn't follow with a certain degree of uniformity from the other. So we can make inferences about them on such a basis, and that one affords no inference by which we can conclude the existence of the other. For these are plain and acknowledged matters of fact. By liberty, then, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determination of the will. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. And note, as he says, this is a kind of hypothetical liberty. This hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Here there is no subject of dispute. So he's saying, if I want to get up, I can. If I want to go to the store, I can. This means there's no sort of external constraint which would prevent me from doing so. If, say, I'm a prisoner and in chains, then if I want to go to the store, that doesn't mean I can. But he says, well, look, like, we have this kind of freedom in the vast majority of cases. Say any case where you'd make a decision that seems to be relatively weighty. Well, if you had had different desires, then you could have acted otherwise. If you had determined to do something else, then you could have. So he thinks this is what we mean when we're talking about freedom. And obviously, the sort of constraints built in this, it's a kind of conditional. It's, well, if I had wanted to act otherwise, I would have. This is a particular type of counterfactual. A counterfactual is a statement that involves, or it's a type of conditional that involves an antecedent which is false, and a consequent that, if the antecedent were true, would be true. So these, again, involve kind of causal judgments. And he's saying, well, so if we think of the human mind as a kind of system that has pressures applied to it, say in the form of desires, and reasons or reason can provide observations about effective means of satisfying a desire. Say, if you want food, then you know where you can find it. Hume says, whatever definition we may give of liberty, we should be careful to observe two requisite circumstances. First, that it be consistent with plain matter of fact. Secondly, that it be consistent with itself. And this is a kind of jab at libertarian theories. Hume thinks that the libertarian notion that we can be free and relevantly non-determined by prior circumstance or event depends on the sort of positing of a kind of radical freedom such that I am somehow completely unaffected by prior circumstance, motive, and inclination. And Hume thinks, well, this is an obvious absurdity. How is it that that actions could be attributed to me if they don't result from things like my character, my motive, my circumstance? And so Hume thinks his definition is capable of providing an explication of that that doesn't enter into any sort of absurdity or contradiction. He claims other theories are incapable of that same sort of virtue. So he says, then regarding the plain matters of fact, he thinks there's particular judgments we have about when we would say somebody is free and when we would not. And he thinks his theory is going to adequately be able to capture and explain which instances we'll say one counts as free, which instances one does not count as free. And so he says, if we observe these circumstances and render a definition intelligible, I'm persuaded that all mankind will be found of one opinion with regard to it. So it's worth considering what exactly is sort of like built into Hume's commitments with regards to this view. Hume claims that when we talk about free will, what we mean is this power of acting or not acting according to the determination of the will, such that I choose to act as such. And we could kind of provide a distance definition, one in which we don't take a stand on whether this is free will or not, where we say a person is Hume free as a kind of term of art that denotes this definition Hume has proposed, if and only if she has the ability to act in accordance with her decisions and to decide in accordance with her desires. In other words, if she chooses to do X, she can. So say if you're at an ice cream parlor, you have a range of options and you decide, I want this one. And so you say, I want that one. Then you've acted perfectly freely. If you had wanted something else, then you could have expressed a different desire.
No, so maybe you can't afford, you want the extra sprinkles or something and you can't afford it. Is that an example of not quite being Hume free, or is that
Good. So it's not the case that you could have had it if you wanted it. In that case, it's similar to the sort of chains on the prisoner, such that they couldn't leave the cell if they wanted to.
you could, yeah.
But you have the freedom to say, like, ask for it still. So
Yeah.
that's where the sort of axis of freedom is with regards to that, or where like the hinge is. So Hume's view is that, well, our desires causally determine our decisions. Say you decide, I want to get some water, or you have the sort of felt desire to get water, and you express that as, I want to get water, and you make the sort of connected, deliberative, practical judgment that I'm going to go get it, and that then leads into your action. So Hume thinks, well, you might say free will is just being able to do what you want. And, well, obviously we have this sort of freedom, and quite obviously, it's, well, this seems to be perfectly compatible with causal determinism. There doesn't need to be any place within which, say, I could have acted in a substantially different way than I do. But that's perfectly compatible with this notion of freedom. He's not saying, I have the power to act in particular situations differently than I actually do. He says, if I had had different desires, in other words, like if the starting conditions of this scenario had been different, then the outcome of that scenario would have been different. And so what he is describing as freedom is this sort of counterfactual condition that must be applied, that Well, if it was the case that I had wanted something different, in other words, if my psychological configuration were different at the start, well, then I would have acted differently. And he thinks that that sort of appropriately locates where it is that we should think of free will as, and that that provides an adequate basis for our judgments of responsibility. Because I can say, well, yeah, you may have acted that way every time given your desires, but if you had had different desires, then you would have acted differently. And then my blame, I mean, you might have an influence on what you do in the future. You decide, like, I don't want to be blamed like that. And so this can then justify these attributions of praise and blame, Hume thinks. So Hume has endorsed this sort of position we might call a kind of compatibilist one. It says that we can have free will and determinism at the same time. The kind of contrasting position captured by libertarianism is that freedom requires a kind of indeterminacy, that it's not determined what I actually will do, that at some particular point in time, say, it could be the case that you could have a sort of description of what sort of like what my psychological or neural configuration is like, and nonetheless you couldn't say exactly what it is I will do. Perhaps you could say, like, what of several things I might do. But Hume thinks, like, you can say determinately, or there's a determinate fact of the matter, what it is I will do at some later point in time. But that's still compatible with determinism. And so Hume's argument, which we can kind of extract from the former passage, is Hume is saying, well, this is what we mean by free will. We mean this power of acting or not acting in accordance with the determination of the will. In other words, if I choose to do this, I can. If I choose to do something else, I can do that. And, well, as we've seen, that's obviously compatible with determinism, the idea that every event is necessitated by prior events. And so Hume says, so look, free will is compatible with determinism. These things which were thought to be in tension with one another are perfectly consistent. And he thinks our attributions of free will actually require determinism, because how else could I appropriately ascribe this action to this person? And a kind of short argument we can append to this to show that the justification for premise 2, or the argument for it, is what Hume's saying could be basically taken as, well, look, there's the Big Bang, the start of the universe, or our sort of like measurement of that as far back as possible. And from that, if you have something like a complete description of the laws of nature and the state of the universe, you should be able to entail out from that all future states or future configurations. And, well, eventually you get to the point at which you're born. You can get a description of your psychological state, of various desires you have. Those are going to ultimately determine what sorts of decisions you make, and those are going to determine what sorts of actions you take. And so he thinks, look, this is obviously compatible with determinism. And so free will is compatible with determinism. Okay. So what we could take Hume to have shown is that at least this notion of free will, what we might call Hume freedom, is compatible with determinism. There's this larger question of whether Hume is actually right about what we mean by free will, whether we mean that just if I had wanted to do something differently than I could have, or whether something more substantive is claimed about the nature of the world, whether, say, I could have chosen, even with the world as it was, and having the same desires, a different course of action. Okay, so this will be it for Hume on the problem of induction, his view about personal identity and free will. We'll be talking next time about theories of truth, how we might classify those, and some kind of initial puzzles that weigh in on those. which are plausible, which aren't, etc.